"I won't need the farm anymore," my own son announced into the wedding microphone, "because my wife and her sister will be taking care of it from now on." Those words floated across the ballroom so lightly that many guests laughed as if he had delivered a charming family joke. I laughed too. At least, that's what it looked like from a distance. Inside, something became perfectly still. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I was 68 years old that afternoon, wearing a navy blue dress I had carefully pressed the night before, the same pearl necklace my late husband, Thomas, had given me on our 40th anniversary, and comfortable low heels because I knew wedding receptions could last for hours. The ballroom overlooked a quiet lake just outside Asheville, North Carolina. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, making the crystal chandeliers sparkle like tiny stars suspended over white linen tables decorated with pale roses and eucalyptus. Everything looked exactly the way my granddaughter Emily had dreamed it would. I had watched her grow from a curious little girl who loved climbing apple trees on our family farm into a graceful young woman beginning a new chapter of her life. That day belonged to her, and I had promised myself nothing would steal her happiness. When Daniel, my only son, stood to deliver his toast, I expected stories about Emily's childhood, maybe a joke or two about teaching her to drive, followed by warm wishes for the future. Instead, he smiled toward his wife Rachel before lifting his champagne glass. "Family always moves forward," he said confidently. "Now that Mom doesn't really need that old farm anymore, Rachel and Megan will finally get to turn it into the place we've all imagined." A few people clapped politely. Someone near the dance floor even whistled. Several guests turned toward me with puzzled expressions, assuming I already knew what he was talking about. I simply lifted my glass, smiled politely, and took a small sip of sparkling water. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed her younger sister Megan's hand. The two exchanged a look that lasted only a second, but it carried the unmistakable confidence of people celebrating a victory long before the race had ended. I noticed Megan quietly showing something on her phone to her husband Tyler. They all smiled. Then they looked toward me. Not with kindness. Not even with sympathy. It was the expression people wear when they believe the hardest part is already over. I folded my linen napkin carefully onto my lap and admired the wedding cake instead. For elegant tiers covered in fresh flowers. Emily had chosen vanilla bean with raspberry filling because Thomas used to say every celebration deserved something sweet enough to be remembered. His absence sat beside me like an invisible guest. There are moments in life when grief whispers softly, and others when it quietly steadies your heart. I could almost hear him reminding me never to rush into anger, never to answer confusion with confusion. Across the ballroom, Rachel leaned closer to Megan again. Their conversation was too quiet for me to hear, but I saw Megan mouth the words, "It's finally happening." Daniel nodded almost imperceptibly before taking another drink. No one noticed those tiny exchanges except me. Or perhaps no one cared enough to notice. The band resumed playing, guests drifted back toward the dance floor, and laughter filled every corner of the room once again. I applauded for the newlyweds, complimented the caterer on the excellent prime rib, and thanked an elderly couple for traveling nearly 300 miles to attend the ceremony. To everyone watching, I looked exactly like the proud grandmother enjoying a perfect family celebration. But while the music echoed through the ballroom, another melody began playing quietly inside my mind. It was made of questions instead of notes. Why had Daniel spoken as though ownership of my farm had already changed? Why had Rachel looked so certain? Why did Megan behave as though she had been invited into a future no one had ever discussed with me? I smiled every time someone looked my way because I had learned long ago that silence often reveals more truth than confrontation ever could. Before the evening ended, I realized something far more unsettling than my son's careless words. Everyone at that wedding seemed to know a plan about my future except the one person whose future it actually was. I stayed until the last dance because Emily deserved photographs filled with smiling faces instead of whispered family tension. I hugged her tightly before leaving, kissed her forehead, and told her that her grandfather would have been incredibly proud of the woman she had become. She smiled through happy tears and thanked me for always believing in her. That simple moment reminded me why I had chosen silence earlier. Some days belong to the people beginning their lives, not to those quietly protecting what remains of their own. As I walked toward the parking lot, I noticed Rachel and Megan standing beside a white sport utility vehicle with Daniel and Tyler. They did not realize I could hear fragments of their conversation carried by the cool evening breeze. "There will be plenty of room once we clear out the old equipment," Megan said. Rachel laughed softly. "The guest house will be perfect after we repaint it." Daniel nodded as though they were discussing a vacation rental they had already reserved. "We should schedule the movers before the end of the month," he added. None of those sentences included words like maybe, hopefully, or someday. They spoke with the confidence of people discussing plans that had already been approved. I unlocked my sedan without making a sound. During the 40-minute drive back to my farm, the mountains stood quietly beneath the fading orange sky. The familiar winding roads had always given me peace. Thomas used to roll down the windows every autumn so we could smell the crisp leaves and fresh hay drifting across the valleys. Even after all these years, I still caught myself reaching toward the passenger seat, expecting to see him smiling back at me. The farmhouse greeted me with its warm porch light exactly as I had left it that morning. Every board, every fence post, every weathered stone had a story attached to it. We had built this place together, one careful decision at a time. Thomas planted the maple tree near the barn when Daniel was born. We celebrated birthdays beneath its growing branches. Emily learned to ride her first pony in the south pasture. Every season had left another memory behind. I walked through the quiet rooms, hung my dress carefully inside the closet, and placed my pearl necklace back into its velvet box. Then I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat beside the kitchen window overlooking the fields. The moonlight rested gently across the pasture where a few horses grazed peacefully. Nothing outside had changed. Yet somehow everything felt different. I replayed Daniel's words over and over. He had not asked whether I planned to sell the farm. He had not suggested helping me manage it. He had spoken as though ownership had already shifted without a single conversation. That was not like the son I had raised. Thomas and I had taught him that respect begins with listening, especially inside a family. Somewhere along the way, that lesson had disappeared beneath louder voices. I opened an old photo album resting on the living room bookshelf. There was Thomas standing proudly beside the red barn after finishing the roof. Another photograph showed Daniel at 12 years old carrying feed buckets much too large for his skinny arms. Rachel was not in those pictures. Megan certainly was not. Neither of them had spent freezing mornings repairing fences after winter storms or sweating through humid July afternoons stacking hay bales. They knew the farm as a beautiful destination. They had never known the years of sacrifice hidden beneath its quiet beauty. Before going upstairs, I looked through the front window one last time. Across the dark pasture, the barn stood exactly where it always had, patient and steady. For the first time since the wedding, I stopped asking myself why everyone else seemed to know my future. Instead, I began wondering who had convinced them that my answer no longer mattered. The following morning I woke before sunrise, just as I had done for decades. Old habits do not disappear simply because the people around you begin treating your life as though it belongs to them. The air carried the cool scent of damp grass, and a thin layer of mist rested over the lower pasture. I filled the horses' water troughs, scattered fresh feed, and walked the fence line with a cup of black coffee warming my hands. Every step reminded me that this land had never been built on dreams alone. It had been built on thousands of ordinary mornings exactly like this one. Thomas used to say that a farm revealed a person's character because the land rewarded consistency instead of promises. Looking across the fields, I realized the same could be said about families. Words spoken during celebrations could sound beautiful, but daily choices always revealed the truth. Around 9 o'clock I drove into town for feed supplies and a few groceries. The cashier, a young woman who had known my family for years, congratulated me on Emily's wedding after seeing photographs posted online. I thanked her with a smile. Before I reached my car, my phone vibrated with a notification from social media. Normally I ignored those alerts, but something urged me to look. Rachel had uploaded dozens of photographs from the reception. Emily and her husband appeared in the first few pictures, exactly as they should have. Then the focus quietly shifted. There were smiling photographs of Daniel, Rachel, Megan, and Tyler standing together, arms around one another. One caption caught my attention immediately. It read, "Excited for our next family adventure. New beginnings are just around the corner." Another photograph showed the four of them laughing together, and someone had commented, "Congratulations on the farm. It is going to be amazing." Rachel replied with a simple heart emoji instead of correcting the assumption. My fingers remained perfectly still on the screen. I did not leave a comment. I did not call Daniel. I simply closed the application and placed my phone back into my purse. Silence often allows people to reveal far more than questions ever will. On my way home, I stopped at the small diner where Thomas and I used to eat lunch every Friday. The waitress recognized me immediately and poured coffee without asking. While I waited for my soup, I noticed Frank Sullivan sitting alone near the window. Frank had been Thomas's closest friend for nearly 50 years. They had repaired tractors together, coached Little League baseball, and shared enough fishing trips to fill several lifetimes with stories. After exchanging greetings, Frank hesitated before speaking. He stirred his coffee slowly and looked toward the window. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I have been meaning to ask whether everything is settled with the farm." I answered honestly. "As far as I know, nothing has changed." Frank frowned. "That surprises me." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "A couple of weeks ago I ran into Tyler at the hardware store. He was asking about fencing materials, renovation permits, and converting the equipment shed into extra living space. I assumed you had invited them to move in." I thanked him for telling me and changed the subject before he could see how deeply those simple sentences had settled into my thoughts. Driving back along the country road, one realization became impossible to ignore. Whatever plans had been made were not spontaneous conversations after the wedding. They had begun weeks earlier, perhaps even months before, while I continued believing my family would always speak honestly with me. The conversation with Frank stayed with me long after I returned home. I did not feel angry. Anger clouds judgment, and I had learned over the years that the truth usually reveals itself to those who are patient enough to wait. I placed the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, put away the vegetables, folded the paper shopping receipt, and continued my day exactly as I always had. The chicken still needed fresh feed. The vegetable garden still needed watering. The old porch swing still creaked gently whenever the afternoon breeze crossed the front yard. Nothing on the farm demanded dramatic reactions. Everything simply asked for steady hands and careful attention. That evening my telephone rang just before dinner. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered warmly, as though nothing unusual had happened at the wedding. He sounded almost unusually cheerful. He asked whether I had made it home safely and whether I enjoyed the ceremony. We spoke about Emily, the beautiful weather, and the excellent food. Then, after a brief pause, he casually asked whether I had thought any more about slowing down. The question seemed innocent until he continued. He said the farm required too much work for someone my age and suggested that having more family living on the property would make life easier for everyone. I listened without interrupting. He never once asked what I wanted. Instead, he spoke about plans that sounded remarkably familiar. More people to maintain the property. Renovations to the guest house. Fresh ideas for the barns. New opportunities for the land. Every sentence quietly assumed that the decision had already been made. When he finally asked what I thought, I simply replied that I appreciated his concern and that I would continue taking things one day at a time. He seemed almost disappointed by how little I said. After we ended the call, I walked into Thomas's old workshop. His tools still hung neatly on the wall exactly where he had left them. He believed every tool deserved its proper place because disorder eventually became expensive. I ran my fingers lightly across his workbench and noticed a small wooden box tucked behind an old toolbox. Inside were neatly organized folders containing maintenance records, insurance papers, equipment receipts, and handwritten notes dating back many years. Thomas had documented everything. That habit had always amused me while he was alive. Now it felt reassuring. As I sorted the folders, I realized how carefully he had prepared for every possible challenge the farm might face. Drought, storm damage, equipment failures, rising fuel costs. He had planned for everything except one possibility neither of us ever imagined would become real. A family that quietly began making decisions without including the people who had built the place. Before closing the cabinet, another memory returned unexpectedly. About a year before Thomas passed away, he had insisted that we spend an afternoon meeting with our longtime attorney, William Hayes. At the time I assumed it involved routine estate planning. Thomas had smiled afterward and told me, "One day you will be grateful that we took care of everything while we still could." I had never asked what he meant because I trusted him completely. Standing alone inside the workshop, those words suddenly carried a weight they had never held before. I did not know exactly what Thomas had arranged, but for the first time since the wedding I began to wonder whether he had seen something I had failed to notice. And if he had, perhaps the answers I needed had been waiting quietly all along, hidden among the careful plans of a man who never left important things unfinished. The next morning I called William Hayes and asked whether he might have time to meet later that week. He had handled legal matters for Thomas and me for many years, and his calm voice carried the reassuring confidence of someone who never rushed to conclusions. He told me to come by on Thursday morning and to bring any questions that had been weighing on my mind. I thanked him without explaining why I had called. Until I understood the full picture, there was no reason to involve anyone else. The following 2 days unfolded with surprising normalcy. I mowed the grass around the farmhouse, repaired a loose section of fencing near the north pasture, and gathered fresh vegetables from the garden. More than once I noticed vehicles slowing slightly as they passed the entrance to the farm. Neighbors often waved, and I waved back with the same friendly smile I had worn for years. Outwardly nothing had changed. Quietly, however, I had begun paying closer attention to details that once seemed unimportant. Late Wednesday afternoon Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He carried a bakery box from a local shop and greeted me with an easy smile that reminded me of the little boy who used to race through these fields with muddy boots and endless questions. We sat on the front porch eating slices of apple pie while the sun drifted lower across the hills. For several minutes we spoke about ordinary things, including the weather, Emily's honeymoon, and a baseball game he had recently attended. Then the conversation gently shifted. Daniel mentioned that Rachel had been browsing decorating magazines and thought the guest house could become a wonderful place for visiting relatives. He spoke about replacing the old flooring, painting the walls, and adding new furniture. He described each improvement as though the only remaining step was choosing paint colors. I listened carefully and asked a simple question. "Has anyone ever asked whether I plan to make changes to the guest house?" He blinked, smiled awkwardly, and replied that everyone simply wanted what was best for me. It was a thoughtful answer, but it was not an answer to the question I had asked. After he left, I remained on the porch watching the last light settle across the fields. The conversation confirmed something I had begun to suspect. No one had come to discuss possibilities. They had come expecting agreement. The next morning I drove into town a few minutes early for my appointment with William Hayes. His office had not changed in decades. Family photographs lined one wall, books filled sturdy wooden shelves, and the familiar scent of coffee mixed with old paper greeted every visitor who stepped inside. William welcomed me warmly and asked how I had been since the wedding. I smiled politely before placing my purse beside the chair. For a brief moment I looked around the quiet office and remembered Thomas sitting in this very room years earlier with complete confidence that our future had been carefully protected. I finally looked back at William and said, "I believe there are decisions being made about my farm that I never agreed to, and I think it is time for me to understand exactly what Thomas wanted me to know." William listened without interrupting until I had finished describing everything that had happened since the wedding. He did not react with surprise when I mentioned Daniel's speech or the conversations I had overheard. Instead, he folded his hands on the desk and remained quiet for a long moment, as though carefully arranging each fact before responding. Finally, he opened a thick file cabinet behind his desk and removed a well-organized folder with my name written neatly across the tab. The paper looked untouched, yet I immediately recognized Thomas's careful signature on several documents inside. William placed the folder between us and smiled gently. "Your husband believed that good planning was one final act of love," he said. "He wanted to make certain that you would always have complete control over your future." My heart became strangely calm. William explained that years earlier Thomas had updated every important legal document connected to the farm. Ownership had transferred directly to me after his passing, and every decision involving the property rested entirely with me unless I personally chose otherwise. No family member could simply move onto the land, renovate buildings, or assume any ownership rights without my written approval. William paused before opening another section of the folder. "There is one additional document," he said quietly. "Thomas insisted that I keep this private unless you specifically asked about the future of the farm." He slid a sealed envelope toward me. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter. Thomas's familiar handwriting filled the page. He wrote that he hoped I would never need the protections they had arranged, but he also knew that people sometimes changed after money or property entered the conversation. He reminded me that kindness should never require surrendering wisdom. He asked me to protect the farm only if it continued bringing peace to my life and never to allow guilt to make decisions that should be guided by judgment. By the time I finished reading, tears rested quietly in my eyes, not from sadness alone but from gratitude. Even after all these years, Thomas had somehow found another way to stand beside me. William then explained one final detail. If I ever wished to let relatives stay on the property, I could certainly do so. However, every arrangement would remain temporary unless I personally signed a separate legal agreement. Nothing had already been promised. Nothing had automatically changed. Every confident statement made at the wedding had been built upon assumptions rather than reality. I leaned back in the chair and slowly released a breath I had not realized I had been holding for days. The confusion that had followed me home from the reception finally began giving way to clarity. William asked whether I wanted him to contact Daniel immediately and explain the legal situation. I shook my head. "Not yet," I answered softly. "I would rather understand what they truly believe before anyone tells them they are mistaken." He nodded with complete understanding. As I gathered the folder and carefully placed Thomas's letter inside my purse, I felt something unexpected replacing uncertainty. It was not satisfaction, and it certainly was not revenge. It was confidence. For the first time since hearing my son's wedding toast, I knew exactly where I stood. The only question remaining was how far everyone else intended to carry a plan that had never belonged to them in the first place. When I returned home that afternoon, I placed Thomas's letter inside the top drawer of my bedroom dresser, exactly where I kept the things that mattered most. I did not lock it away because I was no longer afraid. Instead, I felt a quiet certainty that had been missing ever since the wedding. The answers were no longer hidden from me. Now I simply needed to see how much of the story the rest of my family would reveal on their own. 2 days later Rachel called and asked whether she and Daniel could stop by on Saturday afternoon. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful, almost relieved. I welcomed them as warmly as I always had. Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze moving through the maple trees Thomas had planted decades earlier. I baked a peach cobbler that morning, just as I often did when family visited. By the time Daniel's pickup truck rolled into the driveway, the house smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee. Rachel stepped onto the porch carrying a small potted flower as a gift. Daniel hugged me, and for a brief moment everything looked perfectly ordinary. We sat around the kitchen table, sharing dessert and talking about Emily's honeymoon, the weather, and the busy summer season. No one mentioned the farm at first. Then Rachel smiled and unfolded several colorful pages from a folder she had brought with her. They were magazine clippings filled with photographs of beautifully renovated guest houses, landscaped gardens, and modern country kitchens. She spread them across my table as though we were planning a holiday together. "We thought this style would brighten the guest house," she said enthusiastically. Daniel pointed toward another picture showing a converted equipment shed with large windows and comfortable furniture. Tyler has already looked into materials that would match the existing barn, he added. Megan, they explained, was excited about creating flower beds near the entrance, while Tyler wanted to build new storage shelves inside one of the outbuildings. Every sentence assumed participation. Every idea rested upon an agreement that had never actually taken place. I listened carefully, asking gentle questions instead of challenging their enthusiasm. Have all of you spent much time planning this? I asked. Rachel smiled proudly. For quite a while, she admitted. We wanted everything ready before making the transition. Daniel nodded. We thought it would be a wonderful surprise for you. You would never have to worry about maintaining the property by yourself again. I looked around the kitchen where Thomas and I had spent so many evenings discussing harvests, family dinners, and future dreams. Their expressions were hopeful, almost celebratory. They genuinely believed they were describing a future that had already begun. I thanked them for sharing their ideas and carefully gathered the magazine pages into a neat stack before handing them back. You have certainly put a great deal of thought into this, I said with a gentle smile. Rachel seemed pleased by my response. Daniel visibly relaxed, perhaps believing my silence meant approval. Before leaving, Rachel asked whether they could begin measuring the guest house sometime the following weekend. I answered calmly that there would be plenty of time to discuss everything soon. She accepted that answer without hesitation. As their truck disappeared down the long gravel driveway, I remained on the porch watching the dust slowly settle back onto the road. The afternoon became quiet once again. Birds returned to the fence posts, and the horses continued grazing as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet one thing had become unmistakably clear. This was no longer a misunderstanding created by careless words spoken during a wedding toast. It was a carefully imagined future that had grown larger with every private conversation they had shared, all without ever asking the one person whose answer mattered most. 3 mornings later I was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee when I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy diesel engines turning onto the gravel road that led to my farmhouse. I looked up slowly and watched 2 large moving trucks followed by Daniel's pickup truck and Tyler's sport utility vehicle make their way toward the front gate. The scene would have surprised me if I had not already known exactly what they believed was about to happen. Rachel stepped out first with a broad smile and waved enthusiastically as though this were the happiest family gathering imaginable. Megan climbed out carrying a clipboard filled with handwritten notes, while Tyler began directing the drivers toward the guest house. Daniel walked over with the relaxed confidence of a man expecting everything to unfold according to plan. Good morning, Mom, he said cheerfully. We figured we would get an early start before the afternoon heat. I smiled and wished everyone a pleasant morning. The movers opened the back of the trucks, revealing neatly stacked furniture, boxes labeled by room, framed photographs, and even several large potted plants carefully wrapped for transport. Rachel pointed toward the guest house and began discussing where the living room furniture should go. Megan was already taking photographs of the porch from different angles, talking excitedly about flower beds and fresh paint. Tyler measured the width of the equipment shed with a tape measure while explaining to one of the movers how they planned to reorganize the space. It was remarkable how completely everyone had accepted an invitation that had never been offered. I did not interrupt them. Instead, I invited everyone inside for lemonade while the morning remained cool. They accepted gladly, assuming my hospitality confirmed everything they expected. Around the kitchen table the conversation flowed easily. Rachel thanked me for being so understanding. Megan spoke about future holiday dinners at the farm. Daniel described how wonderful it would be for the entire family to live close together again. I listened with the same calm attention that had carried me through every conversation since the wedding. No one asked whether I had changed my mind because none of them imagined there had ever been a decision to make. After a while I glanced at the clock hanging above the stove. Someone should be arriving shortly, I said pleasantly. Daniel smiled. Perfect timing. The movers are almost ready to begin. A few minutes later another vehicle turned into the driveway. It was not another moving truck. It was William Hayes' sedan. He stepped out carrying a slim leather portfolio and walked toward the porch with the steady confidence I had always admired. Daniel looked puzzled. Rachel exchanged a quick glance with Megan, and Tyler lowered the tape measure still resting in his hand. William greeted everyone warmly before shaking my hand. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said. "Thank you for inviting me." I welcomed him inside, and together we returned to the kitchen table where the folder containing every relevant document rested quietly beside my coffee cup. The room suddenly felt different. The cheerful assumptions that had filled the house only moments earlier began giving way to curious silence. Daniel looked from William to me, clearly trying to understand why our longtime attorney had arrived on moving day. I folded my hands gently on the table and met my son's eyes with the same calm expression I had worn since the wedding. For the first time, every person in the room realized that the future they had imagined might not be the future that had actually been waiting for them. William waited until everyone had taken a seat before opening the leather portfolio he had carried into the farmhouse. His calm voice filled the quiet kitchen without ever becoming harsh. He explained that Thomas and I had completed a comprehensive estate plan years earlier and that every document concerning the farm had been carefully prepared long before Thomas passed away. One by one, he placed the papers on the table, describing them in simple language. The ownership of the property belonged entirely to me. Any permanent occupancy, renovation, transfer, or change involving the land required my written approval. No verbal conversation, family expectation, or private plan could replace that legal reality. The room became remarkably still. Daniel looked down at the documents as though he were reading a story he had never seen before. Rachel's confident smile slowly disappeared. Megan quietly folded the clipboard she had been carrying all morning, while Tyler set his tape measure on the table without saying a word. No one argued because there was nothing to argue with. The facts were clear, and they had been clear all along. After several moments, Daniel finally looked toward me. His voice sounded softer than it had at the wedding. He admitted that he had assumed we would eventually live together on the farm because Rachel and Megan had become excited about the idea and he believed it would make life easier for everyone. He confessed that somewhere along the way they had stopped discussing the possibility and had begun treating it as a certainty. Rachel quietly apologized for allowing those plans to grow without ever sitting down to ask what I wanted. Megan admitted that she had become carried away imagining a different future and realized too late that imagination was never the same as permission. I listened carefully before speaking. I told them that the most painful part had never been the renovation ideas or the moving trucks. It had been discovering that everyone had planned my future without inviting me into the conversation. A family can survive disappointment. A family can even recover from misunderstandings. Trust, however, depends upon respect, and respect begins with listening before deciding for someone else. William gathered the documents and quietly excused himself, leaving us alone around the kitchen table. Outside, the movers began loading furniture back into the trucks without complaint. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, and no celebration. Only the quiet acceptance that assumptions had finally met reality. Before leaving, Daniel embraced me more tightly than he had in many years. He apologized again, this time without offering explanations. I accepted his apology because forgiveness and forgetting have never been the same thing. Forgiveness opens the door to healing. Trust returns only through consistent actions over time. Weeks later, the farm looked exactly as it always had. The horses wandered peacefully across the pasture. The maple trees continued casting afternoon shade across the front yard. Emily visited with her husband one Sunday, and we spent hours laughing on the porch without discussing the moving trucks or the wedding speech. Life slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. As the sun disappeared behind the hills one quiet evening, I unfolded Thomas's letter one more time and smiled. He had been right. Careful planning was one final act of love. The farm remained exactly where it had always belonged, but more importantly, so did my sense of peace. I realized that home is never protected by fences alone. It is protected by wisdom, honesty, and the quiet courage to stand firmly without ever raising your voice. Those are the strongest foundations any family can hope to build.